as Charlotte mentioned, I was really pleased to get the invitation to come and have a chat with you all because some of you, I think, might be aware that we've been working on a new publication, which I'll get into in a moment. There we go. As I start today, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I am zooming in from Gadigal land. I live and work on Gadigal land, and this is land that has never been ceded. And I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Gadigal people for looking after this place and their custodianship, and to all other elders and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Zoom chat with us today. So some of you may be aware of this kind of crazy book project that we've been working on. Ken certainly is, as he has a chapter in this. And some of you may have heard me kind of mention this before, either at the Macquarie Object-Based Learning Symposium we had last year, or in a couple of different places. But I thought I'd recap now that the book is officially out. It's online and published. We're having a launch for it on the 22nd of May that people will be more than welcome to join us in for both online or at the museum at the Chau Chak Wing at the University of Sydney. The book itself, Mediterranean Collections in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, came about after a series of MARC conferences. So that's the Mediterranean Archaeology Research Group, in which I pulled together basically the people I knew working with Mediterranean collections, and over the kind of 3 years or so, it snowballed, and people kept coming out with new collections or different ways that they're thinking about dealing with antiquities here in Australia and New Zealand. And really, one of the questions that kind of arose that kind of led to the book was, what is different about studying, the kind of ancient Mediterranean world from such a large distance? What is different about studying these collections here? What do we do differently as kind of museum practitioners, but also as scholars? And how do our collections kind of differ from those in other Western societies, particularly those in kind of England and the USA? And so a few different themes kind of came about through the book. So the first big theme is obviously the history of collections and provenance studies, which has been really interesting to kind of delve in the different collecting practices here. And I'll kind of talk about that with coins in a moment. The ways that we kind of engage in object-based learning and new kind of pedagogy, and the way that our collections are contributing to kind of shaping and learning and kind of teaching the next generation, both at the high school level, but also at the tertiary level. We did a lot about participatory programming and exhibitions, especially with communities of descent, because one of the big things about Australia and New Zealand is our diaspora populations, that we have massive communities who moved here, especially in the middle of the 20th century from Greece and Italy, and then later from places like Egypt. And now we're having lots and lots of people come and live in Australia from the Middle Eastern communities, especially following kind of turmoil and different war periods and civil war. And there's lots of reasons why people are kind of moving to this country. And how does that kind of shape our collections, and what we do with them is a really interesting conversation that's kind of happening at the moment. And feeding into that is then into repatriation and the ethical care of our collections, including the human remains that have made our way into our collections. Most people in this instance are thinking of mummified remains, particularly people from Egypt have been transported to this country, but there's lots of other kinds of human remains that are actually found in our collections as well, skeletal material in particularly from archaeological excavations that are cared for in different universities in particular. So kind of these are the themes of the book, and I think it's been a really worthwhile and really gratifying project, and I am absolutely indebted to the wonderful Elizabeth Minchin from ANU for being my co-editor, and has really guided and shaped this project in an amazing way, and I can't thank her enough, both publicly and privately. And then the kind of big project for me about this was developing a distribution guide to collections. So people who know me and know my curating styles may have heard me say this before, and that is I really am motivated by not answering the same question over and over and over again. So for the Nicholson collection at the University of Sydney, one of the questions I used to get asked in the old museum all of the time was, why is there stuff from Egypt in Australia? Why does Egypt like Australia? Which turned into a big exhibition called Pharaonic Obsessions, which turned into a book called Egypt in Australia and so one of the questions I get asked all the time at the Nicholson collection, because we have such a large amount of Mediterranean antiquity, is about where everything is. And we get lots of questions from students, from researchers overseas, from governments as well, asking me where things are. Do I know where other collections might be? And really, that was the motivator for writing a distribution guide to the collections, was that so it would be written down somewhere so people didn't have to ask me anymore, which is a very pragmatic way of kind of thing. But it showed me that there was a big gap and that people wanted this knowledge out there. So the collections, so before I get into the distribution guide in particular, this is just a list of our contents page that you might be interested in. There's lots of, this is pulled from a different presentation I gave. So chapter 8 is definitely in by Andrew Jameson at the University of Melbourne. And each of the collections represented here are just kind of a fragment of the way that kind of collections are kind of found across Australia. We tried to be as inclusive as possible, so we wanted to make sure that both public collections, those like that are owned by kind of national and state governments, were involved, as well as university collections, as well as kind of people who may not have permanent display of antiquity, but often have it through their museum, like at the National Museum of Australia or the Hellenic Museum in Melbourne represented. So there's quite a variety of different projects represented here, lots of different case studies for you to sink your teeth into if you're interested. And two very important chapters on numismatics can be found inside the book. One by the wonderful Ken, who in his Ancient Coins in Australian Collections really go into four different collectors from Eugene von Goddard, A.B. Triggs and J.R. Stewart, and W.L. Gale, tracing the story of their collections and the afterlife of these collections, where they are now and why they're still relevant today. And then chapter 10 by our wonderful colleagues in Otago, looking at numismatics and the currency of online access and the different ways that they've been kind of using the Otago Museum collections to develop student projects to help catalogue the collections and develop online exhibitions that allow for people to explore these numismatics in a way that often you don't get to when you've got a static display in a museum. So they're both fabulous chapters to sink your teeth into. But as I said, my responsibility was really the final chapter, and through doing a lot of research and we identified there are about 85,000 artifacts held in about 66 institutions across our two nations. This number has increased. It was 58 last time I presented, if anybody paid close attention when I presented for Ken at the OBL symposium. And I think that Ted is in the room, and thank you very much, Ted, for helping me locate a few coin collections that were not on the map at that time. And I really appreciated the input from lots of colleagues around the country to make sure that this was as representative as possible. Obviously, things change. Private donations come out of the woodwork. Material may be left to institutions that we don't know about. But this is a good starting place, I think, for us to keep going. And I want to kind of come up with a way to keep this as an active map, and talking, maybe it's through asks, or other places, to have more of a live update, so that if something does come out of the woodwork now that this is out in the world and someone says, you missed me, we'll have somewhere to update this and keep it going. But I haven't come up with a plan for that. And I'm interested from the people in this room as well, if there's some place that you would look to find this kind of content. The parameters for inclusion in this catalogue were set very wide, intentionally so, just so we could try and kind of scoop up as much material as possible. Looking at material, the Mediterranean defined very broadly as well, from anything from Southern Europe / the cultures of Rome as it spreads out, North Africa and West Asia, and before around 1000 CE, to try and again make sure that we kind of captured different variations of what the ancient world could be when we were kind of asking people, did they have anything? The research tools to find this kind of content was fun and different. Aggregated data sets do exist. Things like the Museum Metadata Exchange. People may or may not be familiar with this project that came about quite a few years ago now. I don't know how active they are in updating the material, but it's a good starting place to see what kinds of collections are around the country, not just numismatics in general, rather than not just ancient coins. Looking through professional bodies, things like AMAGA, which is the Australian Museums and Galleries Association. Lots of states have individual museum professional bodies as well. Here in New South Wales, we have M&G New South Wales, that are a great kind of professional body that help institutions large and small. Public listing services, Wikipedia is actually a pretty good place to find a list of museums in any country. If you're touristing, that's good pro tip there. As well as my personal and professional networks that leaning in and really just asking people what they had. And I spent a long time emailing every institution I could possibly find to say, do you have anything? To be able to come up with this list of 66 institutions. And one of the things that I think is really interesting that I've been able to kind of pull together from this is a really kind of broad understanding of the collection types and purposes, and the value and why people collect is really interesting. A lot of the collections here, especially the 19th century, come from colonists and elite travelers, whereas into the 20th century, they come from people that are soldiers. We get a rise in tourism, and we get obviously migrants to this country bringing material with them. And they are sourced either directly from archaeological excavations, especially research excavations that universities and other institutions might support and take part in, things like the Egypt Exploration Society, think of that kind of thing. Or from the art market, whether that is both the legal and the illegal one in both ancient times in over the last 200 years or so and today. And of course, they fall into both public and personal usage. If you're in a public institution, your usage is usually related to education and research value. In personal, you are usually related to pleasure. People like collecting things. It's a scientific and it's a phenomenon that I am all too familiar with. In my family, we are a family of collectors. I just took it professional and tried not to keep it in my house. My family collect all kinds of things, from salt and pepper shakers through to kind of Toby jugs. And my dad does have an interesting numismatics collection. To things like personal usage also includes things like memory. People take on antiquities for memory purposes. Either migrants coming to this country might have an heirloom that they've brought with them, or a token of something that they experience, especially that soldier collectors in particular keep things for memory reasons. Personal usage also extends to research value. Like, I'm sure there's lots of people in this room who know of collections for their own personal research, as well as, of course, financial gain. That numismatics and antiquities are something that increase in value over time. And so they are an investment, and people do have investment opportunities. Those that kind of are thought of, and antiquities collections that are thought of as investments and for financial gain, usually find themselves going back into the art market again and again and again, rather than finding their way into a public collection over time. And of course, I'm talking to an experienced audience here, so this shouldn't be new to anyone here. But what is interesting is where we've been able to kind of track down collections to. We have local, state, and federal public collections. We have religious and non-profit institutions with collections. There are universities, there are libraries, and of course there are private collections that both have public access and private collections that are closed. For the purposes of the book, that last category was not included, because it's possible for me to know everybody. So public collections, in our national system, the Royal Australian Mint includes just a handful of ancient coins. They came into the possession of the Royal Australian Mint as part of other coin collections that have been donated over time. And what's very interesting about the way that these coin collections are talked about on their website, as well as any kind of is very much for this educational value. But what's really interesting is because it is a national institution, you have to relate it back to some kind of thing about Australia. And so I find that really interesting the way that these coins are particularly used. Is that to this day, coins are often used to celebrate events or people who are special to society. That's the royal that Australian Mint does now. And that is the loose connection, because all museums, all galleries have collecting policies, that we are governed by different rules. We have different reasons why we accept something into our collection. And you would think that, well, what's Roman coins doing in the Royal Australian Mint? And it is to show just the history of coin and production. The Australian War Memorial is another place where, again, just a very small handful of coins, but larger antiquities are there as well. And these have come from soldiers. And this one in particular, I thought is really amazing because the soldier that they're related to was killed during the war, and his family were given his personal belongings, which included this pouch, which has one ancient Roman coin, as well as an Egyptian or Turkish coin as is listed here, as part of his personal effects. And they were given to his family, and then later on his family donate them to the Australian War Memorial. Next. And these kinds of ways of collecting with kind of personal collecting, the other kind of institution that's really interesting that I think people may be more familiar with is the Powerhouse collection. Alina has a great article in our book that is called, which I can't see because my voice is over the top of it. There you go. Time and Technology, the Ancient Mediterranean at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. I think that her interpretation of this collection and why these collections were formed at the Powerhouse is particularly interesting, because the Powerhouse is a technology museum first and foremost. And so ancient coins fit the bill for collecting practices here because they are able to talk about technology and the kind of usage of coin in everyday life, whether it's about metallurgy. And Alina quite rightly really kind of thinks about the ways that antiquity has been used for display in the ancient, in the Powerhouse, and the way the ancient world connects to modern themes. And often they're kind of thrown in as these extra pieces. And she raises an interesting question about the time that people take to make the mental leaps. And as they are people really, when you curate exhibitions that are kind of wide ranging in scope, that might think about a theme, is an ancient coin with, say, Mercury on it really going to be understood and all of the symbolism, or is it just kind of there as an extra nod, and which visitors are doing the work to connect the dots that you're kind of putting down as a curator? So it's a really interesting kind of spin on the way that coins are used in exhibitions today. Different kind of collecting institutions, as I said, religious centres and religious museums keep ancient coinage for different reasons. The Centre for Coins and Culture and Religious History in Queensland quite clearly state that the reason why they have these is to understand the role of religion in the development of global human community. And the Jewish Museum of Australia, which is down in Melbourne, also has just a few handful of coins that have been donated over time, and you can see the way that they've been displayed. I've blown it up. This is as a stretch for you to be able to read it on your computers. Is alongside the others that talks about ancient Jewish traditions, and the kind of the symbolism of the coins is really the kind of key part here in its display. Private collections, as I said, are really interesting in the way that private collections kind of make their way into public spaces. Is often is a really good example is from the Ravenscar House Museum, which is in Christchurch in New Zealand. It really was that Susan Wakefield was incredibly passionate about the ancient world and kept pursuing kind of collecting as part of their home collection. She had mainly Roman artifacts, which includes, while I don't mention coins in the snippet from the book I provide, other people do talk about the coins, and the way that these kind of snippets were provided of the 66 institutions kind of were written sometimes by myself or sometimes by the curator or person in charge of these collections, and there's a lot of editing that goes back and forth. And I did want to make sure that people could represent what they wanted to represent out of their collections, as well as give us interest into the kind of Mediterranean antiquities that they have. And so something like numismatics may or may not always be listed in the book, even if they do have coins as well. Apologies. I wasn't thinking of the numismatics crowd when I did that, so sorry about that, guys. Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, another example of a personal large collection that has made its way into a public collection. The Lord Talbot de Malahide collection, which is nearly 3,000 coins, or there we go, approximately 2,900 coins in the collection. And they're very rarely displayed, but when they are, they're usually kind of connected to these kinds of exhibitions, the stories of the state numismatic collections, an overview of the kind of coinage that's being done from that kind of connects into Tasmanian history from the end of convict transportation to Federation banknotes and the start of decimal currency. And Roman coins are chucked in because they were donated by a Tasmanian citizen. Over to universities. Most people, I think, are familiar with the university collections around the country. Most universities will have some kind of numismatic collection if they have a museum of antiquities. But one that kind of came out of this research that I was unaware of was the fact that the University of Western Australia, the Burnt Museum, which is, if people don't know, but Catherine and Roland Burnt are very important anthropologists. They were incredibly significant and champion of kind of Indigenous land rights, and kind of their archives and records, especially of the Northern Territory archaeological sites related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural material is incredibly impressive. And their archives are a rich resource that lots and lots of my colleagues that work in Australia use. I had no idea until doing this project that they had collected material from elsewhere, including the Mediterranean, including a handful of coins. So it's about 50 objects all up over in the Western Australian Museum. And the Chau Chak Wing Museum is, of course, the kind of largest of the university collections. We're an interesting museum. If people don't know our numismatics collection, I'm not surprised because we're very bad at highlighting our numismatics at the University of Sydney. We have significant collections, the A.B. Triggs collection, which Ken writes about in the book. You can all go and have a look there. But one of the things that we did in the 1940s is that we were really interested in amassing more and more materials for teaching. Arthur Dale Trendle and James Stewart wrote about this in our archives and talked about how they were acquiring materials, and hoards were a great way for them to really bolster the Nicholson collection. And you can see all the different hoards that we have purchased during this kind of interesting time frame. The other thing that we purchased were a series of plaster casts. And the plaster casts of coins mean that we purchased them from the British Museum. The plaster casts are a really interesting, wide-ranging examples. They've never been catalogued properly. Many of them are actually fallen from the cards that they were originally mounted on and fallen into disuse over time. And so our current project, which is called Keramikos, which is an exhibition of 7 contemporary ceramic artists, one of our artists, Glenn Barkley, who's here in the picture, loves coins and loves basically everything from the ancient world, and really wanted to use the coins and use material from the collections to create ceramic stamps. And of course, I couldn't let him do that with our real or authentic or tinqueries, but a series of the plaster casts that have been fallen and damaged. We talked with our conservators and allowed him to create stamps directly from these plaster casts. And the roundel behind his installation on the shelves, you'll see a whole range of examples of ancient coins recreated as ceramic tokens. In amongst a range of tokens he's made from kind of other kind of weird and wonderful museum memorabilia, shells and pieces to create this beautiful installation. Also, one of the more interesting kind of uses of coin collections, I think, that's currently or just come down at ANU, and I hope some of you were able to go and see artifacts at ANU Classics Museum, because they also invited a series of contemporary artists to come and reflect on their collections and take them up. And Aidan Hartson, who is an amazing artist, a Wiradjuri man, he kind of was interested in the coin collection and examples of gold quite specifically. And you can see in his artist statement that he says that he's always brought back to the question, if First Nation peoples of Australia utilized gold and other precious materials, would we have been seen differently? And so his gold nugget was actually displayed as part of the coin case at ANU as a really interesting way of thinking about First Nations issues and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here, and the way that oftentimes, especially when we were lifting up classics and lifting up kind of ancient Greek and Roman materials, we were keeping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art in the dark in a way. It was othered, it was not considered as high art, it wasn't part of our kind of canons of history, and really kind of making us reflect on those ways. And it's a really interesting way to think about coins and coins as a part of this conversation that we're having in Australia at the moment, and reckoning with our past and the injustices done to Indigenous peoples here. So it's a really interesting kind of example of coin display. And that kind of brings me to kind of the second little component and part of my talk. I think I'm going okay on time. And that is that I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the change in definition of museums that has happened in the last couple of years. So ICOM, the international body that kind of governs museums, that has series of ethics and where we look to for our kind of guidance about what museums do and how we function and the work that we do, voted to change the definition of museum. And that our definition of museum now says quite clearly here, I'll read it out: a museum is a non-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society. We research, collect, conserve, interpret, and exhibit tangible and intangible heritage, which is very interesting. And this is the part that kind of really changed. We have to be open to the public to be counted as a museum, accessible and inclusive, and we foster diversity and sustainability. We operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities. And what's interesting about this change is that museums have really been changing over time, that museums aren't just a place to store stuff, that we are not just a place for passive education, we are not just a place for research, but rather we're a place that has community participation, that we're a place for enjoyment and reflection and knowledge sharing, that it's not a top-down version of museums, but rather inclusive and accessibility is part of the aims of what museums need to be now. That these things don't change overnight. It's not like they put in a new rule and all museums have to be that. This is reflecting the change in museum practice over the last, 20 years and longer. And so it's a really interesting kind of definition, I think. And it's a really interesting way to think about collections and their role and what we can do with collections and why we have them. And numismatics in Australia is a big part of that. And so going back to our kind of ideas about who collects things and why, and the fact that both public and personal usage means that these things end up in, even if they're in personal usage for some time, they'll kind of find their way into public usage over time. A lot of coin collections do. But we have to kind of think about coins as part of this kind of wider antiquities network, that coins can be a place for knowledge sharing. Coins can be a way to have conversations in unique and special ways that I think we're opening ourselves up to in really fun ways. But coins are a big part of the art market itself. And one of the things that I'm really keen on having a chat with everyone here about is about this kind of how to deal with coins in a kind of ethical way. Some really great work has been happening over the last, since kind of the mid kind of 2000s and on, with understanding coins, coin trade, and the kind of illicit antiquities market. And I really love this quote from Augustin Lazar in that he wrote in his article for Countering Illicit Traffic Goods, where items are accepted. He was quite specifically talking about a coin hoard from Romania, But items are accepted without any reservation and large quantities of stolen goods on the grounds that coins circulate, and the one cannot tell where they're from. And so dealers often, and I hear this often as well as a museum curator, and I hear this kind of frequently as this kind of, but because coins circulate, how can we ever be sure where they were from, and how can we be sure that they were what is their country of origin because of this kind of ancient circulation. And it's a challenge for us in museums, and it's a big one that we're continuing to face because, as like I mentioned, the ways that kind of private coins and other antiquity collections kind of surface and come to museums and get donated to our collections is that over time, it's passed down from generation to generation, and second or third generation is really who ends up donating to our institution at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. And oftentimes they don't know exactly where they picked up these items, or if it was from a soldier or a family member. They find it in their homes and they come and talk to us and have these conversations. And so it's getting harder and harder to have this conversation, especially Neil Brody's work is someone I really admire and really interested in. His latest paper that I found from in 2003, he's trying to work out exactly how to demonstrate and can we prove that coins are being illegally stolen and excavated during crisis, especially in Syria. And so this paper in particular, he looks at the kind of the increase in the art market. He compares that with archaeological find spots and the kind of distance from the mints that when we have archaeological evidence for where these coins are found, to be able to look at the increase and matches this against kind of what was being found on the market. And if you read the paper, it's really interesting they can demonstrate exactly the spikes of the market from this kind of Syrian material ending up in the world again. And how this kind of influences and the amount of money that kind of gets shed around is really fascinating, and something that I'm grappling with. And how do I, as a museum curator who is aware that these issues are coming up, have these conversations with collectors and have these conversations with donors as material comes up, because the coins are one of the things that we know are being traded and we know that are kind of entering the market illicitly because they have this kind of veneer of circulation. And it's something that, still grappling with and how we kind of move it forward. And so that kind of brings me to my kind of last slide that I wanted to end on so we could have a chat, if that's keen for people to have a chat, is that, one of the things that guides us as museums and curators and is the national standards. So there's the national standards for Australian museums and galleries, as well as international standards from ICOM. A quote that I love is, it's an aspirational approach to best practice, because best practice is something that is changing and developing all the time. And for ethical curating and numismatics, I think that there's lots of interesting ways that numismatics have a really great kind of role to play, in that, yes, when we are acquiring things, provenance matters, and being able to directly kind of understand where provenance hits. But I think coin collections and antiquities have really great ability to tap into other aspects of ethical curating, things like truth telling, things like accessibility. Coins are something that people can feel and touch and be a part of and really understand a tactile sensation. Coins are a way for people, I think, that representation and belonging is an incredibly important part of ethical curating, in which we're trying to co-curate, develop collaborative research patterns, but also hand the reins over to other people and let them say how they want their history being told in museums. And I think coins have a really interesting place there, because coins have symbols on them. Coins are a part of people's national identity, ancient coins as well as modern coins. And I think if you want to increase a sense of belonging, having coinage and that has symbols and motifs that are familiar to people is a really interesting way to do this kind of work. And so I think numismatics have a really strong place in the future of ethical curating. I think that there's lots and lots of ways that we can think about using coins that I haven't seen done yet, but I'm keen to find out from everyone here what they want kind of what they think coins can do in these kind of spaces, and what these kinds of what ethical kind of curating looks like in museums as a whole.